Welcome to Adventist News and Views, your source for the latest information and insights shaping the Adventist conversation. I'm Jacqueline Frias. Here are the highlights of this week. A faculty hiring complaint at Andrews University raises renewed questions about governance, transparency, and presidential leadership. Adventists in Venezuela call for prayer after U.S. military strikes disrupt daily life and Sabbath worship. A new column warns that Christian nationalism, not persecution, may be the greater prophetic danger facing the church today. A leading Adventist theologian calls for trauma-informed theology and pastoral care. We remember a Ghanaian Master guide whose final act of service saved children's lives. Plus, a profile of George W. Brown, a servant leader whose quiet faith shaped a global church. This week's Sabbath School Reflection examines prayer, gratitude, and the kind of faith the church is forming. Plus, Spectrum Podcast and our Video of the Week features a seminar presentation by Denis Fortin titled How Ellen White Prepared Her Books. A faculty hiring dispute at Andrews University is drawing attention for the governance questions and leadership concerns it has raised. Reviewed by the Association of Theological Schools, the case centers on a 2023 tenure-track search at the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary, where a whistleblower alleges that administrators bypassed qualified U.S. candidates and reshaped the position to advance a foreign national applicant. The university has denied wrongdoing, saying the process followed policy, but ATS agreed that parts of the complaint warranted review. While the accreditation body does not decide hiring outcomes, the case has intensified broader campus unease. Faculty accounts point to delayed hiring, increased administrative control, program restructuring, and limited consultation, alongside concerns about board dynamics and restrictions on campus forums. Together, these issues have fueled debate about transparency, accountability, and presidential leadership at Andrews University. Adventists in Venezuela have called for prayer and unity after U.S. military strikes hit Caracas on January 3, 2026, part of a controversial operation in which Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife were captured by U.S. forces. The East Venezuela Union Mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church posted on Facebook urging members and Adventists worldwide to pray, grounding their hope in Psalm 46, and describing God as a steadfast refuge amid the crisis. Although the church offices and nearby properties were reported undamaged, power outages and security concerns disrupted normal Sabbath worship on January 4, leaving many members at home and making it unclear how families were personally affected as the situation evolves. In her column, The Beast's Tantalizing Wine, Natalie Bruzon reflects on growing up immersed in Adventist end-time prophecy and how those teachings shape her concern about current political and religious developments in the United States. Drawing on Adventist warnings about the dangers of church-state union, she argues that the rise of Christian nationalism and its growing acceptance among Christians, including Adventists, signals a troubling shift. Bruzon points to the use of Christianity for political power, attacks on democratic institutions, and the blending of faith with coercive state authority as signs of the very deception Adventist prophecy cautions against. Rather than open persecution, she warns the greater danger is spiritual complacency and distortion, where power is mistaken for faith and conscience is surrendered for influence. The column urges Adventists to reclaim their prophetic witness by choosing humility, conscience, and faithfulness over political dominance. At the 2025 conference of the Adventist Society for Religious Studies, outgoing President Rodney Palmer called for a trauma-informed future for Adventist theology, teaching, and pastoral care. Drawing on the parable of the Good Samaritan, Palmer, Chair of Religion and Biblical Languages at Andrews University, argued that trauma is not a side issue, but a defining reality shaping how people believe, learn, and relate to faith. He described trauma as something that often occurs on the road, in moments of loss, transition, and uncertainty, and warned that theology can either help heal or deepen wounds when pain is ignored or spiritualized. Palmer urged educators and church leaders to prioritize compassionate presence, truth-telling, and care over abstraction or silence, reframing theological classrooms and churches as places of safety, like an inn on the Jericho Road, where healing, accountability, and resilience can begin. Adventist youth across Ghana are mourning the death of Enoch Abram, a master guide from the Boduburam district of the Southwest Ghana Union Conference, who died while rescuing children during a beach outing. According to accounts shared within Pathfinder and youth networks, Abram entered the water after several children were caught in strong currents and successfully saved 2 before being overwhelmed by the waves. He was pulled from the water, prayed for, and rushed to a hospital where he was pronounced dead. His death has prompted an outpouring of grief and tributes nationwide, with many remembering Abram as a devoted youth leader whose final act embodied the spirit of service, courage, and self-sacrifice central to the Master Guide calling. This week's Adventist Profile remembers George W. Brown, former president of the Inter-American Division, whose life and ministry left a lasting mark on the global church. Raised in the Caribbean and shaped by a supportive local congregation, Brown rose from humble beginnings in Antigua to become a trusted leader known for humility, wisdom, and care for people. Under his leadership, the church grew to more than 1 million members. His legacy is perhaps best captured by a decision not made, declining the role of General Conference president in order to care for his wife. Brown's story offers a portrait of servant leadership rooted in faith, integrity, and love. Sabbath School Spotlight. In this week's Sabbath School commentary, Ezrika Bennett and Crystalline Westbrook Martin reflect on prayer, gratitude, and the gospel through Philippians and Colossians, asking what kind of faith the church is actually shaping. Crystalline emphasizes hope rooted in trust, that God is still at work even when life feels unfinished or unjust, and encourages believers to remain morally awake without denying pain. Ezrika challenges teachings that shame personal prayers, equate blessing with obedience, or prioritize institutional certainty over compassion, warning that such frameworks distort God's character. Together, they argue that faithful Christianity is not about performance, control, or preserving status, but about intimacy with God, honesty about suffering, and a gospel that looks like love, justice, and good news for real people. In Season 2, Episode 4 of Adventist A, Simone Samuels shares her journey from law school to the fitness and consulting world, reflecting on how her third-generation Adventist upbringing shaped but never confined her path. In speaking about outgrowing traditional Adventist spaces, she shares about her search for intellectual and spiritual openness. Be sure to check out these and other stories that are shaping the Adventist conversation on our website at spectrummagazine.org. The latest issue of Spectrum's journal is now available, featuring 7 powerful spiritual autobiographies written by our interns. These personal stories reflect honest faith journeys and thoughtful reflection on belief, doubt, and growth. We invite readers to subscribe to our quarterly print journal or make a one-time recurring donation through our website at spectrummagazine.org/journal. Your support and help sustains Spectrum's mission-driven work and strengthens independent Adventist journalism. And finally, the video of the week features a presentation titled How Ellen White Prepared Her Books by Denis Fortin, former dean of the Seventh-day Adventist Theological Seminary, recorded at the 2017 Georgia-Cumberland Conference Northeast Tennessee Camp Meeting in Greenville, Tennessee.
What I'd like to do this afternoon is to help you understand where the book Steps to Christ comes from. Why did Ellen White write it? How did she write it? And in that way, we get to understand her ministry a little bit more. We get to understand how she put her books together. That helps us to understand her ministry, God's guidance in her life, God's inspiration to her, and also the purpose of her books for us. So these are all kinds of indirect things that we're going to consider this afternoon as we talk about the books of Ellen White. I do this presentation for a number of reasons. Sometimes we have fairly new Adventists who have heard about Ellen White but don't know her very much. So talking about one of her best books, one perhaps that we know the most, is helpful to help young Adventists or young in the faith get to know her a little bit more. A second reason I like to do this presentation is to help people know some answers to all of the nonsense that is on the web regarding Ellen White. All of the accusations, all of the denigration, all of the attacks on Ellen White and on Seventh-day Adventists because of the books of Ellen White, all kinds of falsehoods that are disseminated on websites about Ellen White. And so I'd like to do this presentation to set the record straight when it comes to some of those things. I can't touch on everything. I have about an hour or so, to do it here this afternoon, an hour and a half by the time we're done with questions. So it's a little bit more of an instruction type of event this afternoon, a little bit more as if I were to take you, bring you with me to Andrews University and sit you in my class. This is what I do. We talk about this kind of stuff in my classes. Jeremy, I think, can vouch for that, and some of the other pastors also who have taken my class on issues in Ellen White's studies. It was mentioned this morning by Alex when he did the introduction that I am one of the co-editors of the Ellen G. White Encyclopedia. Some of you may have the book. You may have seen it at ABC's in the Bible and Book House. This book came out about 3 years ago. It is a big book on who Ellen White is, but it is an encyclopedia about Ellen White. It has a number of introduction articles regarding her life, her ministry, her books. I wrote one of those on her theology and the meaning of her understanding of the Bible. And then there is a big section on themes or topics from the writings of Ellen White. So themes like love of God, sin, great controversy, all of the books of Ellen White. There's an article on all of those books. What is the book about in this? Then there's a section also on biography, people that Ellen White was in communication with, that she wrote letters to. All the main people around Ellen White. There's an article on all of them in this encyclopedia. So it's comprehensive. It's a good book to have. Now, I do understand it's an expensive book. It's $70, $69.99, in fact. But once a year or twice a year, you get an ABC booklet that comes through your union paper or your conference paper. And in that little ABC booklet that you get, advertising new books, there are always coupons. And one of those coupons is 25% off. Use that coupon to buy this book. It's worth a lot of money. The coupon is worth a lot of money, 25% off the price. I've invited also churches to buy this book and have it in your library so that people could borrow, look at it. Another good thing to do with this book, it is to buy one and put it in your local community libraries. You got college libraries, you got community libraries in your towns. Each one of those should have this book to, again, be a resource to people who want to know something about Ellen White. Last night I talked about Steps to Christ, this new little edition that I helped to prepare that came out in February, in the context of it being the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. In the introduction to this book, there is an introduction in which I tell the story of the book Steps to Christ. Where does it come from? Again, to try to address some of the questions that people are asking on the internet. The introduction talks about the book, where it came from, and some of the ideas that Ellen White wanted to share in this book. So let me share with you some of the things that are in the book Steps to Christ, and how it came about, and what we can learn about the ministry of Ellen White. By the way, this book, the original book of Ellen White, had black and white pictures, paintings. And in this edition, the Andrews University Press decided to put in the book paintings in color from the 19th century, so the time period of Ellen White, and that would match the content of some of the chapters. So here you have one on the Good Samaritan helping the person who's been hurt putting that person upon his horse, and that's the illustration that goes along with chapter 1 on the love of God. Here's another one, a lighthouse, not as good here on the screen. What to do with doubt? Jesus is the lighthouse that guides us. So there's beautiful paintings also that are found into this book. In the summer of 1890, Ellen White is attending a meeting of pastors. And during the meeting of pastors, the pastors come to her and they say to her, Sister White, could you prepare a little book that we could use as pastors and distribute it to people who come to our evangelistic meetings? A book that would not be very expensive and that we could either give or have our colporteurs sell so that people would understand the plan of salvation. Ellen White loves the idea. It's a good idea. She's agreeing with it. And immediately she sets to work on preparing the manuscript of the book Steps to Christ. The following summer of 1891, the pastors are having again another meeting, this time in the resort town of Harbor Springs, Michigan. It is in the northern part of the lower peninsula of Michigan on Lake Michigan. It is a beautiful spot. It was a resort 100 and some years ago. It still is today. Beautiful place, beautiful beaches, and waters are calm, and it's nice. They're having a retreat there, and that summer, so a year later, Ellen White asks Marion Davis, her assistant, to take the manuscript and to tell the pastors how it was prepared, and ask the pastors if they like what they've done, if they like the book that they've prepared in the manuscript. And so Marion Davis does that. She has an information session with the pastors explaining to them how they have prepared the book Steps to Christ. I'm hoping that you're beginning to have some questions. Two people preparing the book Steps to Christ? Yes. Hang on. Here's what's happening. Where's the title coming from? That's a good question. People are wondering, where is the title coming from? I told you last night that the first edition of this book started with which chapter? Chapter 2, our chapter 2, which then was chapter 1. And it's the chapter on the sinner's need of Christ. That's the original first chapter of the book. In that chapter, which is the first chapter then, there is the story of Jacob fleeing from Esau, and one night he is laying down on the ground with a rock as his pillow, and what does he see in a vision? He sees a ladder going up and down between heaven and earth, and angels going up and down between heaven and earth. And at the end of this passage, which is a passage from Genesis chapter 28, Jacob wakes up and he calls this place Bethel, which is the gate of heaven. And people have the impression that Ellen White chose the title Steps to Christ as a reference to this ladder, that Jesus is the ladder, that we do steps with Christ to heaven. So we don't really know, but I think this is kind of where the title may have come from. This is a copy of the front page of the first edition. As I mentioned yesterday, the book was published by Fleming Revell, a non-Adventist evangelical publisher in Chicago. Again, for the sake of those who were not here last night, when the manuscript was ready in the summer of 1891, people began to wonder who would publish this. Well, the de facto answer is the Review and Herald, of course, would publish this. But there is an evangelist that is attending the meeting who is a fairly recent convert to Adventism, George Starr. He is a pastor in Chicago. He's an evangelist, an Adventist evangelist in Chicago. Before he became a Seventh-day Adventist, he was an evangelical Baptist evangelist with Dwight L. Moody in Chicago. And Dwight L. Moody in Chicago has a brother-in-law that has an evangelical publishing house that publishes the books for Dwight Moody. And that's Fleming Revell. That's the name right here at the bottom of the first edition of the book Steps to Christ. George Stars says to Sister White, I know somebody that probably would love to publish your little book if you don't mind trying something different. Well, Ellen White's all surprised. What are you talking about? Well, there is this Fleming Revell in Chicago. It's an evangelical publisher. I know him, and I've worked with him. He's the brother-in-law to Dwight L. Moody, and I'm pretty sure he wouldn't mind publishing your book. Do you want me to make the contact? Ellen White says, why not? And so Stars makes the contact. Ellen White begins a conversation with Fleming Revell, and Revell says, yes, I'd be delighted to publish your little book. Send me the manuscript, let me look at it. And it is. A few months later, in February of 1892, so 125 years this year, this little book is coming out from Revell in Chicago. The first and only book of Ellen White to be published by a non-Adventist publisher. Here is what Fleming Revell said when he did a little bit of an advertisement regarding the book. Now I'm reading it again. Some of you were not here last night, and those who were here last night, I don't think you will mind that I repeat this. Fleming Revell said that this little book, Steps to Christ, is a remarkable book. He said, it is not often that a publisher has the opportunity of announcing a third edition, technically it's a third run, not edition, of a new work within 6 weeks of the first issue. This, however, is the encouraging fact in connection with Mrs. E.G. White's eminently helpful and practical work, Steps to Christ. If you will read this work, it will ensure you're becoming deeply interested in extending its circulation. Steps to Christ is a work to guide the inquirer, to inspire the young Christian, to comfort and encourage the mature believer. The book is unique in its helpfulness. Can you believe somebody saying something so good about the books of Ellen White? Wow, what a beautiful testimony from an evangelical Baptist publisher in Chicago. And he says the book is good for three kinds of people. Those who don't know much about Christianity, those who are new in the faith and want to know a little bit more what it is to believe in Jesus as our Savior, and the mature Christian who wants to go a little bit deeper. So it's a good book for everybody. Wow. I wish we would take this statement and put it on all the bad websites about Ellen White. There we go. Anyway, Fleming Revell publishes the book early February 1892, 125 years ago. As I've said last night, the book has 12 chapters. Our current book has 13 chapters. Now, those of you who were here last night, you don't answer. Revell has 12 chapters. Our current book has 13 chapters. Which chapter is added in our current book? Now, those of you who were here last night, you know the answer. How about the others? Which chapter is added? It's the first chapter that is added. Our current first chapter is not in the book that Revell published. What's the chapter about? The love of God for humanity. Really? Yes. That first chapter is not in the first edition that Revell published. Ellen White began the book that they prepared and shared with pastors in 1891. She had prepared 12 chapters, and the first chapter was the chapter on the sinner's need of Christ, our current chapter 2. It so happened that Revell had bought the copyright for this book only for the United States of America, not for the other countries of the world. And so when Adventists in Europe wanted to publish this little book a little later that year, and in England, we have a publishing house near London. And then when Adventists in Australia also want to publish this little book, Ellen White says there's one way to get around the copyright that is not going to cause trouble. We're going to change the book. If we add one chapter, it's a different book, therefore it's a different copyright. So that's what she does. She talks with Marion Davis, and the two of them prepare chapter 1. And then when it is published later in England and in Australia, the Adventist edition has 13 chapters. In 1896, 4 years later, the Review and Herald buys back the copyright from Revell. And so from that moment on, in the United States, the book is published by the Review and Herald. But the first 4 years, the book in the United States has 12 chapters. The book in the other parts of the world has 13 chapters. Isn't that intriguing? Even among Adventists, there's two different versions. The American version, the other country's version. But the difference is very important, as I mentioned last night. If you begin the book Steps to Christ talking about the sinner's need of human beings, of Christ, the book begins a little human-centered. The book has a focus on how difficult we are, how much of a problem we are, because we are sinners. If you begin the book talking about the love of God, the tone of the book is changed. You have a book that now is focused on God, at least begins with God, and gives a tone of starting with the love of God. So, the book is changed by adding this very precious chapter. But it is nothing new. Ellen White by then was beginning to reshape her Conflict of the Ages books by focusing on the love of God and helping us understand the love of God. Again, as I mentioned last night, what are the last 3 words of the book Great Controversy? God is love. The first 3 words of Patriarchs and Prophets, God is love. So Ellen White is beginning to understand the entire Bible story from Eden to New Jerusalem in the context of the love of God. And how does that affect the love of God? And to add 1 chapter to Steps to Christ on the love of God is therefore not something new for her. She is thinking that way already. Maybe it was an oversight on her part, preparing the book perhaps a little too fast to have it published and forgetting to talk about the love of God. Maybe that's what she realized almost immediately when the book came out by Revell. So when the book begins to be published in the United States, this is the way it looks. And here at the bottom, you have clearly the Review and Herald Publishing Association in Battle Creek. This is an 1898 edition from the United States. Immediately, the book begins to be translated. Doesn't take long, appears in French, and then in German, and then in a multitude of languages. The book has been published so far into 160-some languages. That's a lot of languages. We don't know many books in this world that have been translated in so many languages. And then the book, of course, has been published by the millions. Millions of copies of this book have been spread all around the book. How did Marion Davis work with Ellen White? Okay, so here it is. In 1890, Ellen White receives the suggestions to prepare Steps to Christ. She turns to Marion Davis, who is her helper. Marion Davis is the most trusted literary assistant, we would call secretary, perhaps editorial assistant, that Ellen White has. Ellen White has a 3rd grade education. That's all she has. She went to school until 3rd grade. Then she had her accident. Her accident really changed her a great deal. She suffered a great deal. She tried to go back to school in the following school year. She lasted a few days, and then she stopped. She could not take it. It was too hard for her. So she has a 3rd grade education. And in those years, a 3rd grade education is perhaps just like today. You learn some things, but you don't learn some other things. And then when it comes to composition, writing, grammar, writing a sentence, writing a paragraph, putting the right punctuation at the right place, she is not able to do that. She writes like she speaks. And her letters tend to be simply a long paragraph with no breaks, with no punctuation sometimes, or not clear punctuation, or deficient punctuation. And so the way she writes her handwritten manuscripts are somewhat deficient. And from the start, she understood that God, in His inspiration of her ministry, did not inspire all the commas and all the paragraphs and all the sentence breaks and all the capitalization of words. That is not part of God's inspiration of her writings. Even the vocabulary is her vocabulary. She will not put on a piece of paper a word she has never heard. It has to be a word she knows. That's how God works with her. And so she understands that. Therefore, she employs a number of helpers who will take what she writes, will type it, and correct it. Correct the grammar, the syntax, the spelling, do proper punctuation, do proper capitalization of words, and do proper paragraphs in her writings, because they're not like that in the originals that she writes. That's simply the weakness, so to speak, of Ellen White. She will therefore employ a number of literary assistants to help her in this work. How are they paid? They're paid by the royalties coming from her books. The publishing house gives her royalties, and with the money, she pays her assistants. That's how she's able to do her work and be able to finance this. The church is not paying for these people who are working for her. She is paying for those people. And at sometimes she's got a number of them that are helping her, so it's a lot of money, so to speak. She loved working with Fleming Revell, because at the time when Fleming Revell publishes her book for 4 years, that Little Steps to Christ, she gets money from him like she has never received before. Fleming Revell is a good businessman, and he understands authors, and he gives to Ellen White better royalties than any of the Adventist publishers have given her before. In fact, she's beginning to be upset with the Review and Herald and with Pacific Press for not giving her her due. She should be receiving better royalties, and they are a bunch of stingy people who don't want to pay her what should be paid to her when it comes to royalties. But now that has a domino effect. If she does not get enough money, she cannot pay these people that she is employing. So she's a little upset with the fact that the review is not coming through with being honest with salaries, royalties. And so when Fleming Revell begins to publish her book, and he gives her better royalties than any others has given her before, she's delighted, she is blessed, she is happy. And the temptation comes when Revell asks her, "Do you have any other books that I could publish for you? Because I love that kind of writing and these kinds of books." Ellen White says in some of her letters that she is really tempted. But she decides that an Adventist press should have the profit from her writings. And therefore she asks the Review and Herald to buy back the copyright, and she closes her relationship with Fleming Revell. But she would have loved probably to continue. Be that as it may. Marion Davis comes along and helps Ellen White. Ellen White had a nickname for Marion Davis, my bookmaker. My bookmaker. Ellen White called Marion Davis my bookmaker. So it's not Ellen White making the book. It is Marion Davis making the book for Ellen White. Okay, I hope some questions are coming up there in your mind that you can ask later. Marion Davis is responsible for preparing for Ellen White and with Ellen White and with some of the other assistants most of the books that are published by Ellen White during the 25-year period that Marion Davis worked for Ellen White, 1878 until she died in 1904. 25 years Marion Davis works for Ellen White. And during that period of time, Ellen White asked Marion Davis to prepare her books. Which books? Well, all of these books. All of them were books prepared by Marion Davis. In 1884, Spirit of Prophecy, Volume 4. The Great Controversy in 1888. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 5 in 1889. Patriarchs and Prophets in 1890. Steps to Christ in 1892. Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, 1896. The Desire of Ages, 1898. Christ Object Lessons, 1900. The Testimonies for the Church, Volume 6, 1900. And then the first part of Ministry of Healing, 1905. Marion Davis dies in 1904. The book comes out a little later. All of these books here are books that were prepared by Marion Davis in her work for Ellen White. How did she do that? What's the role of Ellen White in all of this? Hang on for a moment here. Let me go back a little bit in a couple slides. Marion Davis was asked by Ellen White to look in the writings of Ellen White, the Review and Herald articles, the Signs of the Times articles, other books that Ellen White had published before Marion Davis came to work for Ellen White. And she asked Marion Davis to go through all of these materials, the manuscripts, the letters, the sermons of Ellen White, to look into all of that, and to gather from these materials the paragraphs, the sentences, the chapters, the articles that would fit into the books that Ellen White wanted to see prepared. You see, here's what's happening here, is that after 1870-something, none of the books of Ellen White are written cover to cover. None of the books of Ellen White are written cover to cover. Here's what I mean. We have this little book here. There's page 1, there's page 200, 300. We have the impression that one day Ellen White decides, I'm going to write a book on steps to Christ. She takes a pad of paper, she takes a booklet with lines in it, and she begins to write. God reveals himself in two different ways, through nature and revelation. And then she writes, first page, second page, until page 120-something. We have the impression that this is how Ellen White wrote her books. No. None of the books of Ellen White are written page to cover. They are written by assembling together, gathering together things that Ellen White has already written in the past. And they're put together in a scrapbook that Marion Davis prepares, shows Ellen White, and from there they decide what they're going to put in the various chapters and in the various pages. So none of the books after 1870-something, it's hard to know exactly where it begins, are prepared in this way by Ellen White's staff with Ellen White's supervision. And they are compiled, so to speak, gathered from all of the material that Ellen White has written so far. Here's what Ellen White said regarding the work of Marion Davis as Marion Davis is dying of tuberculosis in 1904. This is in the diary of Ellen White. Marion, my helper, faithful and true as the compass to the pole, in her work is dying. I am leaving tomorrow for Battle Creek, yet my soul is drawn to the dying girl who has served me for the last 25 years. We have stood side by side in the work and in perfect harmony in that work. And when she would be gathering up the precious jots and tittles that had come in papers and books and presented to me, now she would say, there is something wanted. I cannot supply it. Let me pause here. What's Ellen White trying to say? Well, Marion Davis had gathered together a number of passages to prepare, let's say, a chapter on something. But it doesn't flow together. It doesn't flow well. Obviously, it's coming from different places. And so she would ask Ellen White, it's not flowing well. Can you fix it? Can you tell me what to do here? Do you want some other stuff being brought in? Or could you, Sister White, write what's missing in between these paragraphs, and then I'll work with it to make it flow better. You see, Marion Davis could not write what's missing. So if she takes a paragraph from an article here, and then another paragraph from a sermon here, and puts them together, they're two different contexts, maybe it's not flowing. The verbs may not be working well or something. So she's asking Sister White, help me here. I cannot do your work. You have to do your work. That's what Ellen White is relating to here. Well, I would look over, Ellen White says, and in one moment I could trace the line right out. We work together, just work together in perfect harmony all the time. She is dying, and it is devotion to the work. She takes the intensity of it as though it were a reality, and we both have entered into it with an intensity to have every paragraph that shall stand in its right place and show its right work. It's a beautiful testimony of Ellen White regarding the work of Marion Davis and how they worked together. Now, a quote from this are to say a couple things. First, to emphasize, to let us know that Ellen White acknowledged how Marion Davis worked. Second, that Marion Davis acknowledged how Ellen White needed to finish the work because she couldn't, that the two of them worked together in the preparation of these books. And as I've mentioned, here's the list of books that Marion Davis worked on while she worked for Ellen White in that period of about 25 years. Now, there's a couple of other books that are published at about the same time that are not in this list. That's the book Temperance, that's the book Education. They are prepared by other people. Temperance is prepared by Kellogg, Education is prepared by Prescott. Again, in the same way, presenting it to Ellen White giving the final word, editing some things, and then it's being released afterwards. There are a number of rumors, falsehoods, and false stories on the web that circulate quite extensively regarding Steps to Christ. And it has to do with the accusation or the conspiracy theory, so to speak, that Ellen White did not write Steps to Christ, but Fanny Bolton wrote Steps to Christ, one of the assistants of Ellen White. Again, knowing exactly how the books are prepared helps us to understand that this cannot be true, because it is Marion Davis who prepared the manuscript. Ellen White told us that, and she presented that manuscript to the pastors' meeting in the summer of 1891. There's more. This rumor appeared for the first time in 1932. The claim came out that Fanny Bolton had written the book Steps to Christ. Well, the curious thing is that Fanny Bolton has been dead for 6 years when that happens. When that false report came out, Fanny Bolton had died already in 1926. And to know about this also, good to know, is that the year that Ellen White works on preparing the manuscript, 1890 to 1891, those 2 summers, that year, Fanny Bolton is not working for Ellen White. She is a student taking a master's degree at the University of Michigan. So that year, she's not working for Ellen White. How could she have written Steps to Christ? She's not working for Ellen White. When the accusation came out in 1936 and thereafter, the Ellen G. White estate prepared a big series of documents called the Fanny Bolton Story. And these documents, you can find them on the web. If you go to the Ellen G. White estate website, you just Google Fanny Bolton Story documents or the source documents. If you have the Ellen G. White app on your phone, iPad, or computer, that bunch of documents is on your app. It's already there. It's in the secondary material, not in the Ellen White material, but in the other kinds of material. One more thing to say regarding the Fanny Bolton accusation and conspiracy theory and falsehood is this testimony from Fanny Bolton herself, who wrote in 1894, in the late summer of 91, just before Ellen White goes to Australia. The manuscript is ready for Steps to Christ. And Fanny Bolton pleads with Ellen White to be re-employed by Ellen White. She loves to work for Ellen White, but she's difficult sometimes. Finally, Ellen White decides to give her a chance one more time. So she re-employs Fanny Bolton, and Fanny Bolton goes to Australia as part of the team with Ellen White. In 1894, so 2.5 years, or year and a half after the book Steps to Christ is published, Fanny Bolton is working with Ellen White in Australia. She writes a letter to a friend by the name of Malcolm. Fanny Bolton says this regarding her work for Ellen White. Sister White is the prophet of the Lord for the remnant church, and though the Lord has seen fit to choose one for this work who is not proficient in grammar and rhetoric, and this lack is supplied by others, her assistants. Yet she is responsible for every thought, for every expression in her writings. Every manuscript that is edited by her and by her assistants goes back to her for examination, and this work committed to those who have been called to labor in this branch is not done without prayer and consecration. She's talking about herself here. Now, as far as changing Sister White's expressions are concerned, I can say that just as far as it is consistent with grammar and rhetoric, syntax, her expressions are left intact. Beautiful testimony on the part of Fanny Bolton, telling of her work with Ellen White, never claiming that she is doing original writing for Ellen White. She never did, during her lifetime, claim that she had written anything for Ellen White. So it's a little bit out of the blue that in 1832, 6 years after she dies, there's this rumor that begins to circulate. Nothing true about it. But let me go back to Marion Davis. How did she do her work for Ellen White? I mean, we looked at the series of books here. She worked on a lot of the precious books of Ellen White. Great Controversy, Patriarchs and Prophets, Steps to Christ, Thoughts from the Mount of Blessing, Christ Object Lessons, The Desire of Ages. I mean, she worked on all those books. How did she do her work? Well, we know that. We know how Marion Davis did her work for Ellen White, and a number of professors and people who worked at the White Estate through the years have mentioned this. So this is not new here, what I will share with you this afternoon. In fact, most of what I've done here so far this afternoon, you can find the same information in the Ellen G. White Encyclopedia, in the article on Marion Davis, in the article on preparation of Ellen White's books, and in the article on every one of those single books. So there's a lot of information out there already. It's just that we don't really know about it. It's not discussed very much. Ellen White called Marion Davis my bookmaker, and she is doing a work that is of a different order. What did she mean by that? Here is what she meant. Marion Davis's work had a number of levels. One of them was to plan with Ellen White what the book would look like. So when the idea of a book came out, Steps to Christ, let's stay with that illustration all afternoon, they would decide on how the book would be prepared. First of all, who is it for? A testimonies for the church is for the church. But a book like Steps to Christ is for whom? People who are coming to evangelistic meetings. So it's a different audience. You've got to be careful with the vocabulary, how you present things, because it's for non-Adventists. Okay, so they would decide that together. So Marion Davis would keep that in mind. Then they would decide how much space are we going to give to each of the topics in the book. 5 pages, 10 pages, 20 pages. How do we do this? So they would decide that together. How much do you want to give to this? Do you want to talk about it a lot or just a little? Marion Davis would talk to Ellen White. They would make a decision. And then, what's the best relationship between topics? In other words, in what order are the topics going to come? Do you want to talk about the love of God first, before you talk about repentance? But then after repentance, what do you want to talk about? Confession or prayer? Which one comes first? They decide that together. likely Marion Davis would make a suggestion. Here's what I think would be the best order for these chapters. So that's general work, just the outline of the book. Marion Davis would be involved in that with Ellen White. But sometimes it's more specific. The chronology of the events in the books of Ellen White. Now I need to take another example. Desire of Ages. Now you know from reading your Bible that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't necessarily have the same order of the events of the life of Jesus. Sometimes Matthew has it first, Luke has it second or third, and the order of the miracles and the order of the visits of Jesus to villages is not necessarily in the same order. And the way the events are happening is not quite. And then also an example, the temptations of Jesus. There are 3 of them. Well, Luke has one order, Matthew has another order of the same temptations. Which one are you going to choose? Well, Marion Davis with Willie White were responsible to make a suggestion to Ellen White. Here's the order we think those chapters should come in. Which one do you decide? You basically have to make a decision. You cannot say Matthew's order is more inspired than Luke's order. You can't do that. You cannot say that one book of the Bible is more inspired than the other. If you do that, you get into trouble. They're both inspired by God. And the diversity is okay. God doesn't mind the fact that the facts are not lining up, that they're seeing something from their particular perspective. So they made some decisions. That's how they did it. It's working together, so to speak. Okay, number 2. What comes next? Well, once they've decided this, basically, here in the order of the chapters and the name of the chapters and what the chapters are going to talk about, what comes next is that Marion Davis would prepare scrapbooks. How many of you remember scrapbooks? You remember scrapbooks? Okay, very good. These big things, newspaper print kind of paper, and you would cut and paste things that you would get from magazines and journals and newspapers. And you cut and paste into scrapbooks, and you would keep that. Marion Davis would buy scrapbooks, and then she would devote sections of these scrapbooks to various chapters of the books of Ellen White she is working on. And then she would begin to gather from the various writings of Ellen White things, paragraphs, sentences that fit into this chapter. That's what she would do. And she would do a literal cut and paste. That's what she would do. So she would retype an article and then cut it and put it in the scrapbook. So let's say on the subject of confession. That's what she would do. She would find all kinds of things in the writings of Ellen White that she remembered that had to do with confession, or the love of God, or the need of sinners, and so on. And she would cut and paste into the scrapbooks. And then she would go into unpublished manuscripts, sermons, diaries, and so on. She would read the stuff of Ellen White and look for things that are relevant. Put them in the scrapbooks. You see the picture emerging? It's a little complicated, isn't it? Yes, it is. Number 3, what comes next? Well, then Marion Davis, after doing the cut and paste, would now begin to cut and paste again. She would rearrange these paragraphs and these sentences. They're not necessarily in the right order. They don't make sense. So she would try her best to make sense of these various things that she had cut and paste into the scrapbooks. She would prepare rough categories on a particular subject, and then she would begin to be a little bit more specific. She would rearrange things, rearrange the paragraphs into the cut and paste she had done. She would perhaps change the way the paragraphs begin, particularly if they come from a diary of Ellen White. It sounds like a travelogue, so she would adapt that. And then, number 5, as she goes along and then the chapter is beginning to take shape, she would sometimes do some minor word substitution. Sometimes the same word is repeated 3 or 4 times in 1 or 2 paragraphs. Marion Davis, being good with English, would suggest to Ellen White, let's change some words here. Let's use synonyms, and to make sure that we're not saying the same thing over and over. Substitution of conjunctions, substitutions of adverbs, substitutions of verbs, but looking for synonyms. That's what Marion Davis would do here. That's number 5, minor word substitution. Number 6, she would also, because it's cut and paste, delete some things. She had gathered perhaps too much. She had too many paragraphs. We don't need that many. We need only half of that. So she would cut. Which ones do we delete? Which ones do we put aside? And which ones do we keep for this particular chapter of Steps to Christ? She would delete redundant expression and unnecessary paragraphs. Number 7, now she goes to talk to Ellen White. When she's got that kind of a rough draft of a chapter, she would go see Ellen White, and she would ask Ellen White for some suggestions to add, to change, to amplify, or to bridge, because the paragraphs may not have been flowing properly. And Marion Davis would suggest to Ellen White some things that probably needed to be done. But Ellen White has the last word here. So Ellen White is consulted. There's a back and forth that happens between Marion Davis and Ellen White. And number 8 is very important. Like Fanny Bolton said, no original writing. Marion Davis could not write a sentence into the manuscript. It had to come from Ellen White. Either Ellen White wrote it or Ellen White dictated it as they were talking. Marion Davis would have a pen and paper, and she would scribble things that Ellen White was telling her on how to put things together. You see the big picture? Is that different than what you thought? Very different, isn't it? No books of Ellen White are written cover to cover after 1870 something. In her early years, yes, they're written cover to cover, 1 chapter at a time. But after that, after 1870, 75, 78, all the books of Ellen White are prepared this way by her assistants, gathering material from all the things that Ellen White has written, the letters, the manuscripts, the sermons, and so on. Let me give you an example of this to help you understand here. In the preparation of this little book, the new edition of Steps to Christ, because I wanted to do an annotated edition, and I wanted to read it for me and either mention the Bible verses that Ellen White is talking about but did not mention the Bible verse, or she's using expressions that may be a little difficult to understand today. I wanted to be able to put a note at the bottom of the page explaining some of these things. But I wanted to do one more thing. I had heard what I shared with you here in the last 10 minutes. I had heard this when I was a seminary student 35 years ago. I had heard that. My professor from the White Estate had said exactly what I just shared with you. In fact, that's his notes. It's Dr. Kuhn, Dr. Roger Kuhn. And I had heard this, but nobody has any evidence of it. But today, we've got electronic databases that have put into electronic format all of the writings of Ellen White. So here's what I did. I took my computer, this one right here, and on it, I've got the writings of Ellen White in my app from the White Estate. And I took every sentence from the book Steps to Christ, every single sentence of the book, and I took the key words of that sentence, about 3, sometimes 4, and I typed them into the database to see which writings of Ellen White would pop up that has the same sentence. It's easy to do, and then the Ellen White Estate app that I have gives me the date of the publication of that statement. So I looked at all the statements published before 1891, 1890, because that's when the book is prepared. So I did that with every single sentence of this little book. It took me 2 or 3 years to do this, very long, tedious, and boring sometimes, but still amazing to some extent. This is the very first paragraph of chapter 2. Man was originally endowed with noble powers and well-balanced mind, and etc., and so on. You have 3 colors there: a light purple, a blue, and black. This entire paragraph comes from 3 different places in the earlier writings of Ellen White before 1891. The purple comes from one place, the blue comes from another place, and the black comes from a third place. Marion Davis had read the writings of Ellen White regarding the thought of this paragraph. She did a cut and paste of 2 or 3 sentences from here, from there, and from there. And that became paragraph number 1 in this chapter. Here's where it comes from. The purple comes from Signs of the Times, October 6, 1880, paragraph 1. I used the word adapted, meaning by this that 1 or 2 words have been changed, but the rest is identical. The middle in blue comes from an article published in the Review and Herald, February 28, 1888, also paragraph 1. And then in black, these 2 sentences come from, taken verbatim, from the Great Controversy, the 1888 edition, page 506, paragraph 1. I did this for every single sentence of the book, and for the first time, an Adventist publication of the writings of Ellen White has in the appendix, right here at the back of this book, has in the appendix where every single statement of this book comes from in the earlier writings of Ellen White. This is what this little book is good, is that it tells us where it comes from. And in response to the accusation or the ghost story or the conspiracy theory regarding Fanny Bolton, most of these statements were written before Fanny Bolton became a Seventh-day Adventist. One more evidence that Fanny Bolton did not write this book. We do know now where the book comes from. It comes from all these places in the writings of Ellen White before 1890-91. And this is how Fanny Bolton did it. Wow. Are you overwhelmed? This is complicated work. This is very complicated work. I would find that very complicated to do, but she did. That is the work that Marion Davis did to prepare the books of Ellen White. We have not done this, that I know, with any of the other writings of Ellen White. I think I'm the first one to do it with this little book, because I wanted to know. I had heard, I had been taught in my classes, but I did not know. I wanted to know. It was a surprising study to me. And now it made me clearer, at least in my mind, to understand how Marion Davis worked for Ellen White and how that work functioned for her.
That's it for this week in Adventist News and Views. Subscribe for more stories that matter to the Adventist community, and let's keep the conversation going.